Contact reports with Greek information.
Contact Report 069.
Aha. Were the gods and demigods of Greek mythology such settlers from space?
Sure, they were a splinter group of descendants of the Hyperboreans.
Oh well, now I understand to some extent the connections. Good old Heracles said some very wondrous things, which just refer to it. But now I wonder how big these Hyperborean descendants must have been. Because with Asket, I once had the opportunity to see something that will probably remain closed to the Earth human forever. And exactly according to what I saw, these Greek mythology gods or demigods must have been several meters tall. Heracles alone must have measured about 3 meters, right?
Sure.
Well, then is it also correct that Noah was around 3.10 meters tall, while Adam actually measured around 5 meters?
Sure. Only Adam was less than 5 meters tall. He was still a little more than a meter shorter than that measure.
Contact Report 070.
Ha, good. But now 2 more questions, or 3, regarding our and your Pleiades. So this name comes from Enshrish. Was it simply retained later on Earth? Or was this group of stars referred to differently here?
The name was retained, but lost itself in the confusion of languages that appeared on Earth, and then, over time, returned to its original value, mainly due to mythologies.
These are probably the ancient Greek as well, right?
Sure, but there are also others, as you mentioned through the main one.
Contact Report 102.
Well, then another question. Slowly I find myself dumb, because the longer I go on, the more unclear it becomes to me as to what the terms incarnation and reincarnation mean. As I have been taught, these terms mean one and the same thing, namely incarnation or simply rebirth, whereby incarnation simply means incarnation, and reincarnation means rebirth or birth, which translates both into an understandable language. But now especially the parapsychologists come and set the incarnation for the past, and also for Emmanuel's incarnation as divinity, while they only set the term reincarnation as rebirth.
These terms come from the ancient Greek language, and this rather naive distinction has already struck us, which is why I talked to Ptah about it, who learned the ancient Greek language in Greece when it was the only colloquial language there. His explanation was that both terms were used in the same form and for the same purpose, and that there was no difference, because the term incarnation only functioned as an abbreviation of the term reincarnation. Therefore, if you simply use the term incarnation, then you are not making a speech mistake or a naming mistake, because incarnation in this sense is only the abbreviation of reincarnation.
Thank you very much. These firecrackers from parapsychologists, esoterics, and linguists can quite often get you in a fix with their claims.
Contact Report 125.
Those, my friend, are the names, as I already promised them to you long ago. Listed in accordance with our alphabet letters, I selected 21 male and 21 female names for you, as these were common on Earth about 14,000 years ago and were brought at that time by our direct ancestors. The names handed over to you come from 2 languages, the original Lyran and Vegan languages, but at the same time, different dialects were united by those living together on the Earth. Unfortunately, due to all the cataclysms in the course of thousands of years, only very few of these names were preserved or preserved in similarity. In the main, they only exist in old languages, which have already become historic languages on your planet and are only spoken very seldom. In many cases, however, they have also fallen to rather bad changes and distortions in these languages, so they are often hardly recognizable therein. Most values are still contained in the so-called ancient Greek, but this language itself already represents a distortion, for truly, this concerns the latest Minoan. Thus, that language which was spoken by the people of the Minoans and which, by these, was taught to the ancient Hellenes Greeks, together with many things of their culture at that time, until the Santorini volcano exploded about 3,500 years ago, and the Minoans had to flee to the mainland. If it should be possible for me time-wise, I will perhaps transmit to you 3 female and 3 male names from each letter in some time again, but for my part, this should not be a promise, so do not count on it. For my part, I would be very glad if through the given list of names, these old names, which are also still current with us, would find use again on Earth, for they are truly value-containing. Now farewell, my friend, until next time.
Contact Report 159.
That is probably so. But tell me now about the names, how everything is with these. I mean, of what origin, etc. are they?
The names transmitted to you are exclusively those which have been in use among our peoples for ages, and which are still commonly used among our peoples today in a modified form. These names are first names, according to an earthly sense, and each one has a certain meaning. The rule is that for a person who exercises some specific activity, this activity is then added as an explanation to the name. For example, if someone had worn Trjgdan as a name and had pulled ships along the channels, then this human being was named Trjgdan, who pulls the ships, or Trjgdan, the ship puller. That's how the determinations of the names have arisen.
There are, however, still quite certain emphases of letters.
That is of correctness and very important, for only the emphasis of certain syllables results in the correct pronunciation of the name. But in this regard, I will be helping you with the name lists.
Contact Report 214.
Good. Then to the question. In the 20s of this century, the city of Izmir burned down completely, and the cause of the fire was never clarified up to this day. Do you know anything about this? The Greek population of the city then fled, and were picked up in the ship's harbor by the garrisons of the Allied crews and was brought to Greece. The city burned for 3 days. It was the year 1920, 1921, or 1922.
That is also known to me. The purpose of the fire, which was secretly arranged by the Turkish military leaders, served to drive out the Greeks, against whom Mustafa Kemal had fought with his army and was victorious over them. Thus the fire of Izmir served as an ethnic cleansing during the Greek-Turkish War.
And who was the evil one, or who were the evil ones? I mean, who had ordered the fire?
It was a joint decision of the executives around Mustafa Kemal Pasha. He himself had nothing to do with it.
Contact Report 231.
Usually medical agents also have side effects. Is that also the case with the galantium you mentioned? What did you call it?
Galantamine, not galantium. Yes, if the drug is misused or overdosed, it causes delusions, anxiety, euphoria, insomnia, restlessness, etc.
Hallucinations?
Also,
And do we already know the material?
the plant and its active ingredient were already known to the ancient Greeks as well as the ancient Persians, the early Ottomans and their predecessors, but also to the Caucasians, where the plant Galanthus nivalis was originally native. Even then, the plant and its active ingredient were used by local folk medicine for the treatment of brain weakness and dementia. Especially in elderly people, the remedy was used to stimulate brain activity. The active substance galantamine was rediscovered on the Earth at the end of the 50s when it was extracted from tubers or bulbs of the Caucasian Galanthus nivalis plant by a very complex purification process. However, The substance will only be synthetically produced in the next decade. As a review of the future has shown, and it will then also be discovered that the active substance galantamine is also suitable for the treatment of Alzheimer's dementia, but will not be approved for treatment until after the turn of the millennium. Technically speaking, it will be an anti-dementia drug, that is to say, a drug against brain weakness. However, it is not an actual remedy, but only an active substance that will have a slowing effect on the course of the disease, and that only in the case of moderate and mild symptoms.
Contact Report 236.
You say it correctly. It is only an apparent contradiction because in truth there is none. At that time, my daughter explained the facts to you completely correctly, but with the thoughtlessness that she mixed up earthly linguistic terms a little with new and ancient languages and moreover with ours. The term bromine also exists in our language as the word bromos. But for us, this has the same meaning that the term chlorofluorocarbon has in the German language. In our language, we designate the chlorofluorocarbon simply as bromose, which is expressed in the German language simply as bromine, but for us, this also has the meaning of foul-smelling gas. This word is also found on the earth in the ancient Greek language in the same form as we have it in our language, namely bromos, but with a slightly different meaning, for in the ancient Greek language the word bromos means bad smell. So at that time, my daughter expressed the facts quite correctly with her explanation, but with the use of a word from our language that she simply converted into the German language, yet into the term bromine gases, and thus a terrible misunderstanding arose which she did not realize at the time and which has first officially made its appearance now since you directed the appropriate question toward it.
Contact Report 239.
So far, so good. There is still another word that has a resemblance with the word faun, but which is stated a little differently, so namely the term fauna. Naturally, certain things of Roman and Greek mythology are well known to me, and thus also your explanations. My question, however, is aimed at something else, so not at mythological explanations, which are nevertheless interesting. A faun is, so to speak, a sexually lascivious being, whose corresponding nature is, to my knowledge, designated as faun-like, whereby this faun-like even means sexually lascivious. But now, the word or the term fauna comes into play. Fauna was, according to Roman mythology, a field and forest goddess, and also the wife of the legendary king Faunus, who was a grandson of Saturnus, and the father of Latinus. Here you see, it is in the encyclopedia, that Latinus was venerated after his death, just like Silvanus, as a prophetic field and forest god, and later became equated to the Greek god Pan. Then, in 194 BC Tao's, an associated cult came into being on the Tiber Island in Rome. And now the crux of the long speech. Fauna not only stands as a name for the field and forest goddess Fauna, but also as a term for the animal world. Fauna also similarly means animal kingdom, etc., whereby fauna-like would then have to mean beastly, beast-like, animalistic, etc.
This word fauna is also of ancient Lyran origin, and is just as common with us as it is also still common on the earth in its human languages. Nevertheless, I make the astonishing finding with your explanation that you correctly pronounce the expanded and defining form of the word and term, and also apply it correctly, which does not appear with the earth humans, unfortunately, as I know.
What do you mean?
You said fauna-like.
Do you mean that this word formation is correct? Do you mean that if one speaks of beast-like, animal-related, beastly and animalistic, always in the sense that just the life and operation, etc. of the animal world is meant, then the word and the term fauna-like is correct, and not faunish?
Certainly. Nevertheless, the word is called fauna-like, fully according to the original word fauna. Faunish, on the other hand, is an entirely wrong designation if it concerns the animal kingdom, because the term faunish solely stands for sexual lasciviousness.
Well, my friend, that is exactly what I wanted to know, because I have always been of the view that the word fauna-like is actually correct and not faun-like. If the basic word fauna contains an A, then the expanded word must also have an A. Otherwise, a completely wrong term arises.
With which you are in the right place to give the truth.
Thank you.
Contact Report 269.
The Greek philosopher Pythagoras, born in Samos around 570 BC, probably died in Metapont around 500 BC. Based in Croton in northern Italy, as I wrote there, a union with religious, scientific, political, and ethical aims. This was the Pythagorean alliance. From Pythagoras comes the teaching that the essence of reality is the number, as well as the teaching of the so-called transmigration of souls. Mathematics, astronomy, and acoustics owe important insights to the Pythagoreans. Pythagoreans were especially Eurytos, Archytas of Taranto, Hippasos of Metapont, Ekphantos and Hikitas. The long explanation for a short question now is whether you know whether Pythagoras was a pure earthborn human or an immigrant from the depths of space, by which of course I do not mean Pythagoras as a person, but his spiritual form.
His spirit form was of extraterrestrial origin and came from the Henoch lineage, from the lineage of the ancient Lyrans.
Contact Report 290.
We just discussed it some time ago about the term pagan that you used in the last contact. In our religious view of the world, however, this word means as much as non-Christian, or not belonging to a recognized religion. Can you tell me the meaning of the word, how you understand it, and what its actual origin is?
Certainly. The origin can be found in the early ancient Greek language, and the actual meaning is foreign tribe's stupid cult. So the term in no wise has anything to do with Christianity or with any other religion which has adopted the terms heathen, pagans, and pagan in order to thereby designate, according to their religion, non-believers. So in Christianity, thus non-Christians, in Islam, non-Muslims, and in Judaism, Gentiles, etc.
Thank you very much for your explanations.
Contact Report 293.
Good. As is customary in your language. You call human beings of our or your kind simply human beings or humanoids, while you call other human beings who do not resemble us or you anatomically, both externally or internally, extra-humanoids or extra-human beings. Here on the earth, at least in the German language, this sounds a bit strange, especially because we have a different term for furry people, one that is borrowed from Greek. This is how we call anatomically foreign people xenohumanoids, which means foreign humanoids, or xenoanthropos, which corresponds to the term foreign person. Could we then use these earthly terms in the future when we talk about anatomically foreign people? There is probably still the term extraterrestrial, but this does not mean what it should mean when we talk about anatomically foreign human beings. Exohumanoids are actually correct.
Contact Report 345.
Very well. But now that you are here, I have a question. Look here. This little article with the picture was sent to me. Unfortunately, the information was missing from which magazine the article came from. Anyway, I was asked if I knew what origin the bronze disc with the cosmic representation or the Pleiades was from. Do you know anything about it?
We have two similar sky disks in our possession. One comes from ancient Greece and the other from the Sumerians. The object pictured here is probably from ancient Greece. I myself am unfamiliar with the object, but it is identical in appearance to our specimen from ancient Greece.
Then this is probably not a Celtic product, but an ancient Greek one.
This will certainly be the case. because the Nordic races of former times had a considerable trade with the southern countries. So also with ancient Greece, but also with the Sumerians and Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Medes and Iranians, etc. But even before that, the Northerners were already trading with the Southerners, and trade was even going on as far as the Far East.
Contact Report 362.
Although I thought you could do better, because you probably know a lot more than I do. But if you like, when I met my future wife in Thessaloniki in Greece in 1964, on Friday, the 25th of December 1964, it was through a woman named Vula, who came from Corinthos, where her parents still lived. On Monday, the 25th of January 1965, my bride and I celebrated a simple engagement, and I gained some unpleasant insights into the life of her family, which caused all of us unpleasantness, so that we had to separate again. Secretly, my bride was only 17 years old at the time. We obtained all the papers, 22 of which were different, in order to be able to marry, for which we first had the written permission of the parents, who then wanted to withdraw it by depositing our marriage papers at the authorities in Thessaloniki. During the time I lived in Thessaloniki, I earned my living by repairing electronic equipment such as music boxes and coffee houses, as well as radios and metal detectors, etc., in addition to selling shirts. Within a short time, living with the family became unbearable, and the father of my bride, Georgios, wanted to stab me and her with a knife, for the purpose of which he came to Thessaloniki from Katharini's pulmonary sanatorium, where he had been admitted due to illness. And since the conditions were getting worse practically by the hour, I kidnapped my bride on Thursday, the 25th of February 1965, and disappeared with her to Corinthos, where we found shelter with Vura's parents, who had also moved back to Corinthos, because her German husband had been arrested in Thessaloniki as a result of serious fraud and later sentenced to 3 years in prison. However, neither Vula nor my bride and I knew that her husband was a swindler, which is why we naturally fell out of all clouds when the arrest occurred. Of course the mother, Efrosini, and the father, Georgios, filed a complaint against me, which is why I was internationally advertised and wanted for kidnapping and theft of human beings and girls, precisely because I had stolen and kidnapped my underage bride. Of course, then in Corinthos, the astynomia, that is to say, the police could not hide our presence with Vula's family, which is why they appeared at our house on Saturday, 20th of March 1965, and took us in a jeep to the police station. At the police station, I was then confronted by the head of the police with the report of the human theft, whereupon I naturally told the whole story of the family terror. Thereupon, the chief of police telephoned for more than an hour with the police of Thessaloniki, who obviously knew the family circumstances of my bride, and thus confirmed everything. When the telephone call ended, the man grinned and declared that we were free, and that we should see to it that we would get the marriage papers. Until then, he arranged everything with the pastor of his church so that we could get married as soon as we had the papers. He made it clear to us that we should go to Thessaloniki as soon as possible and collect the papers from the authorities under the excuse that they were needed by the parents. He himself, he said, would telephone the person in charge of the authority next Monday to arrange everything. He also explained that we would have to copy the papers and then return the copies to the authority, but bring the originals to him, the chief of police, in Corinthos. 2 days later, on Monday the 22nd of March, my bride and I made a hitchhiking trip to Thessaloniki, where we arrived in the morning of the 23rd of March and actually received the papers at the authorities. As advised by the chief of police, we immediately made copies, brought them back to the authority, and disappeared with the originals to Corinthos and brought them to the police. That was on Wednesday, March 24th, 1965, and then everything happened very quickly. The police chief sent us home while he went off to settle everything with the priest and the authorities. Only 3 hours later he came to us and reported that everything had been well arranged so that we could marry the next day, Thursday, the 25th of March, 1965. When that was done, he had us officially picked up by his forces, as he said amusedly. It was probably at 10:00 when the wedding ceremony took place in front of the altar, because it was not otherwise possible in Corinthos at that time, after which we went to the authorities immediately afterwards with the chief of police, who was present at the wedding in civilian clothes in order to settle the official matters. Afterwards he brought us home and explained that he would now send his armed warriors pro forma to officially arrest us and me as girl kidnappers. At the same time, I should take the marriage certificate with me. Okay, 20 minutes later a police jeep pulled up from which 4 people armed with machine guns got out. Since we were already waiting for them in front of the house, things happened quickly. We got into the jeep and drove to the police station where the boss welcomed us with a grin and ordered us in. Then he officially announced to me under several witnesses that I was arrested for girl abduction, etc. as discussed. I then handed him the marriage certificate and explained to him that the girl I had kidnapped was my now wedded wife, because I only kidnapped her to marry her and to free her from the clutches of her vicious mother, who was the main ringleader in the family terror. Well, well, said the police chief, flanked by some law enforcement officials who diligently applauded his words, that is a different matter. And we are not aware of anything that the kidnapping of one's own wife is a criminal offense. There must be some mistake. So please go about your business, and congratulations. Those were roughly his words, which were confirmed by the attending legal representatives, and we were able to go our way with many congratulations. But now to Corinthos and the Peloponnese, about which the following must be said. Corinthos is the capital of the administrative district, and is situated in the northeast of the Peloponnese. The city has about 30,000 inhabitants and is located at the Gulf of Corinth. It is an inlet of about 130 kilometers long, and this separates central Greece from the Peloponnese. Corinth has an artificial canal, the Canal of Corinth, which is about 6.35 kilometers long and about 24.5 meters wide, and was built between 1881 and 1893. The city was founded by the Dorians in the 10th century BC and was the most important and richest trading city in southern Greece after Athens in ancient times. Corinthos also has a rich history in relation to the Corinthian War and in relation to the rule of the Romans and Macedonians, as well as the Byzantines, the Turks, Crusaders, and Venetians, etc. The Corinthian War lasted 9 years, from 395 to 386 BC, I think, and was fought against Sparta, together with Athens, Argos, and Thebes. When the Macedonians were driven out, Corinthos belonged to the Achaean Confederation from about 243 BC, after which the Romans destroyed the city in 146 BC. Only in the year 44 BC the Romans repopulated the city as a so-called Roman citizens' colony. This, in addition to the fact that the city also became known through the so-called Corinthian letters in the New Testament. The area of Corinthos is strongly earthquake endangered. Therefore, the city was destroyed in 1858, after which Nea Corinthos, that is to say, New Corinthos, was rebuilt 6 kilometers away, northeast of the destroyed city. If I remember correctly, Corinthos has only belonged to Greece since 1830 or so, before the Turks left, who had been the occupying forces since about 1458. And in relation to the Peloponnese, it has to be said that it is only connected to central Greece by the canal or isthmus of Corinth. As I have already mentioned, the canal was cut from 1881 to 1893. The peninsula has about 700,000 inhabitants, and the administrative district is Tripoli. I do not know much about the history of the Peloponnese, but I do know that in ancient and archaic times there were important political and cultural centers, such as Olympia, Mycenae, and Sparta, etc. There was also the so-called Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens, which was in the period from 431 to 404 BC, if I remember correctly. This was about the domination of Greece. Apart from that, there are several other war stories, such as the Archidamian War, according to Archidamus II, king of Sparta, but I am not very familiar with these events. As far as I know, the name Peloponnese is based on Pelops, who according to Greek mythology was the son of Zeus, Tantalus, and a nymph. Tantalus was the favorite and confidant of the gods, but was thrown by them into the underworld, where he must stand thirsty in water that always recedes when he wants to drink. Furthermore, branches of fruit hang above him, which also spring back whenever he wants to eat from them. According to the Greek myth, Tantalus had to suffer this punishment because he slaughtered his son Pelops and presented him to the gods as food, thus testing their omniscience. The one killed by his own father was then resurrected by the gods. He then deceived Hippodamia into his wife, the daughter of King Oenomaus. Hippodamia then bore Pelops 2 children, Atreus and Thyestes, while he became a powerful king in southern Greece. This is what I remember from what I have learned about Greek mythology, about the history of Corinthos, and about the Peloponnese. Whether the dates are correct, as I have called them, and whether the connections are correct, that
Everything matches my knowledge. Be confident, your memory is good.
Contact Report 372.
Speaking of poisoning, one more question comes to my mind. It has been said since time immemorial that King Alexander III of Macedonia, that is to say Alexander the Great, was murdered by poison in Babylon. However, Quetzal explained to me in 1984 that this would not correspond to the truth. He told me that at the age of almost 33 the king had fallen ill with the West Nile virus during his war campaigns in Babylonia, namely in Babylon in the year 323 BC, whereby he had been treated by his doctors with all kinds of healing juices and beverages. One of the juices would have been a brew of white hellebore, and this brew would have finally led to the death. If I remember Quetzal's words correctly, the brew was used to irritate Alexander's throat several times a day with a buzzard feather soaked in it to induce a vomiting. The opinion of the doctors at that time, always according to Quetzal, was that it was assumed that vomiting would be extremely beneficial against fever, headaches, nausea, and cramps, as well as all kinds of other terrible things. This procedure with white hellebore would then have caused the death of Alexander the Great after 12 days or so, which, however, had not been intended by the doctors. White hellebore, or simply false helleborine, as the plant is called, grows in many countries and is highly toxic, and to my knowledge the poison also finds use in homeopathy, especially for diarrhea with vomiting, dysentery, as well as for collapsed states and circulatory weaknesses. For my part, I know the plant from the Alps and the Pyrenees as well as from the Jura, where the white hellebore belongs to the typical flora, of which basically everything is very poisonous. So the rootstock and the roots as well as the whole stem, leaf, and flower structure. And what else has to be said about Alexander the Great? He was a murderer without thinking, who himself murdered his best friends at will and was immensely addicted to conquering, which is why he also created a gigantic empire through campaigns of conquest, which spanned from Macedonia to Egypt and as far as Persia and India, and that within only a few years, from 336 to 323 BC, during which he was king. Everywhere he designated the capital cities after his name, namely Alexandria or Alexandropolis. If I remember the history lessons correctly, he was born in Pella, Macedonia, Greece. In 356 BC, his father was King Philip II of Macedonia, who was treacherously murdered, which Alexander was able to witness secretly, which subsequently shaped him into a multiple murderer himself, but which did not prevent him from being a scholar of Aristotle. But now the question, why should Alexander the Great have died unintentionally due to the brew white hellebore, if the brew was actually used as a medicine? Do you know anything about that?
White hellebore, that is to say false helleborine, belongs to the family Liliaceae, and thus to the lily family. The plant goes by the Latin name Veratrum album Linn, and is indeed very poisonous. In prehistoric Greece, white hellebore, that is to say Veratrum album, was the most important medicinal plant altogether. It was regarded as the central medicine of the herbalists, the root diggers, for whom the plant was regarded as carrier of magical powers. Hence they approached the plant only using shamanic rituals. White hellebore was considered a holy plant of the gods. Snuff powder was the most important application of the root, and thus found a nasal use to induce artificial sneezing, in which was intended to cause disease spirits and disease demons to escape from the sick body. The poisonously active substances of the plant are steroid alkaloids and steroid-like alkaloids, with 3 ester alkaloids to be mentioned as the main active substances, namely germarin and protoveratrine A and B. But to answer your question now, Alexander the Great was indeed not murdered but died due to a so-called medical professional error. The king was indeed infected by the West Nile virus, lay seriously ill, and was treated by his personal physicians with all kinds of ointments, decoctions, and brews. And in fact, it happened. The way Quetzal explained to you that Alexander the Great was being treated daily with a white hellebore brew, just as you said. A bird of prey feather was dipped 2 to 3 times a day with the tip into the brew to then be inserted into the king's mouth. Thereby the palate was tickled until a vomiting occurred. This procedure was repeated daily for about 12 days, causing Alexander the Great to be unintentionally poisoned in small amounts without receiving a lethal dose all at once. In this manner, the poison was slowly accumulated in his body, and namely until the dosage was that large that the man died. Still to explain is that with an intake of 1 to 2 grams of dried powder white hellebore, and with higher fever, the entire arrangement brings forth a deadly effect. In smaller quantities, white hellebore can very well serve as an effective medication.
Eerie to have to die like this. When I think of how the man must have suffered, regardless of whether he was a multiple murderer or not.
It is not to be wished on anyone.
Contact Report 399.
Then I would like to take up the following. Erich von Däniken, as well as Krasa and various others who write about historical events, claim in countless cases that all over the world there is evidence in many peoples, or that they have found such evidence that extraterrestrials are supposed to have intervened in the development of the Earth humans. They also submit all kinds of photos and materials that they consider and declare as evidence. In my opinion, and according to your statements, however, most of this evidence is worthless, because very many of the things show no relation to extraterrestrials, but only to the works of Earth humans. Simya, say you and Quetzal. You once declared that it is only about 4% of everything that Erich von Däniken describes in relation to things of extraterrestrial origin. Is that still true, or has his hit rate increased since then?
At that time, when Erich von Däniken's research concerning things of extraterrestrial origin were stated by us with 4%, it referred to all his research at that time. But what he has continued to produce since then, and what he calls extraterrestrial origin, or rather what is supposed to be evidence that things would point to extraterrestrial gods and space travelers, is simply based on unfounded assumptions, hopes, and illusions. Thus, since our statement, with all the material further collected by him, the percentage of the correctness of his statements has fallen to below 0.6%.
Which proves that extraterrestrials were extremely rare on Earth in ancient times, etc., as was the case with certain gods who were extraterrestrials, while most of the deities were pure inventions of Earth humans and therefore imaginary figures. So an enormous number of things of the old times are of pure earthly human origin. So in relation to technology and thus to mechanics, medicine, architecture, mathematics, geometry, and all knowledge and ability in every respect. And when I think of the Greek Archimedes, who as a mechanic, inventor and mathematician taught the representation of any large numbers as well as the determination of the square root and the pi number, 3.141529, already more than 2,200 years ago. In addition to the fact that he brought the solution of cubic equations and the calculation of curvilinearly limited surfaces and bodies of rotation, then it must be said that today's knowledge and the entire development is based on that of humans from the old days. They were the ones who fundamentally heralded the actual progress of the Earth humans, even though all their knowledge and skills were lost again and had to be found again in modern times. So what exists today was often conceived, calculated, found out, worked out, and produced thousands of years ago by Earth humans, even if in an ancient kind and wise and according to the technical and medical and other possibilities of that time. And all these things, ideas and inventions, etc., did not originate from the knowledge of and not from the help of extraterrestrials, but solely from the ideas, thoughts and considerations, as well as research, etc., of the terrestrial people. Extraterrestrials really only had their hands in very few cases. But back to Archimedes, he discovered the center of gravity and the weight of the lever, but also the inclined plane and the theorem of static lift. As a mechanic, he also built hydraulic machines and war machines, such as lever mechanisms and slingshots, etc., beside gear wheel gears and a distance meter, that is to say, mileage counter. He also invented a gear wheel timer and a gear wheel sun-moon clock and many other technical, mechanical, and mathematical things. Today, in 2005, this is only some 2,200 years ago, Archimedes was, if I am not mistaken, born in Syracuse in 285 BC, and also killed there in 212 BC, when the Romans conquered Syracuse. But even in earlier millennia, many inventions were made, insights were gained, and countless things were achieved by Earth humans without the influence of extraterrestrials, which were lost, and only in modern times were they rediscovered, reinvented, and reapplied, and will continue to be so. If the development had not stagnated at that time in the old times for various reasons, and if all the already acquired knowledge and skills had not been lost, then the Earth humans would have invented cars, etc. already at that time, besides the rockets and the building of space telescopes and space stations. And it would probably be the case that the Earth human would have long since mastered spaceflight, would have flown out into the vastness of the universe, would have found foreign planets and human beings, and would have settled on other worlds. All this, however, not with the help of extraterrestrials, but solely through their own terrestrial genius. So I see the whole thing according to all that the earthly human history of development and progress has brought, besides what your father, Svath, Askit, as well as your daughter Sim-Yase and also Quetzal have already explained to me, whereby I naturally also take into account all that I know about you.
Contact Report 439.
In fact, only 7 Crusades have taken place, with King Louis IX taking part in the 6th and 7th Crusades. He was born on the 25th of April 1214 in Poissy in the department of Yvelines. He served as king from 1226 to 1270, and from 1248 to 1254 he took part in the 6th Crusade, which led across Egypt, and in 1250 he and his army were captured by the Egyptians, but were released by a high ransom. On the 7th Crusade, his life was ended on the 25th of August 1270 before Tunis, and he was canonized on the 25th of August 1297 after the last bastion of Acre was lost in Palestine in 1291. The Teutonic Order, a Christian or spiritual order of knights, led since 1230 a crusade against the pagan Prussians or Prutzi or Old Prussians, and, in vain, against the Lithuanians. The Prussians were Baltic tribes, which were settled between the lower Vistula and Memel. The tribes consisted of free peasants, who opposed the Christian missionary attempts of the rabid Teutonic Order with great resistance, but were subdued from 1231 to 1283. A further missionary campaign was launched against the Lithuanians, but in vain, as the venture was unsuccessful. The Crusades were carried out with enormous and brutal violence through murder and manslaughter, torture and evil massacres in the name of God, the Lord of love, and Jesus Christ. And so it turned out that here too Christianity was written in blood, for the Crusades alone claimed the lives of some 1.35 million humans. Sustained political successes could not be achieved with the whole murder, nor could a desired unification of the Latin and Byzantine Church be achieved. However, what was created for a long time with a great deal of murder, torture, manslaughter, robbery, destruction, and bloodshed by the Crusades was the securing of the trade routes of Venice and other Italian city-states and in the eastern Mediterranean. In addition, the Crusades brought about contact with Byzantium and the Islamic world, which created the conditions for the Greek and Oriental consciousness to become known in the Occident and in Europe, respectively. This, however, was again based on the fact that the Greek and Oriental consciousness was stolen by the papacy and the Pope's vassals and incorporated into the Vatican. So Christianity, and especially the Vatican, did not shy away from robbing and stealing on a large scale. Now, as for the so-called Children's Crusade, I can only confirm my father Svath's teaching to you, for the crusade of the poor did not take place through children, for in fact this claim corresponds to a Christian-made lie and legend. The truth is that poor people such as farmhands, farm women, farm servants, maids, and male and female day laborers from France were led to ruin in 1212, partly with their whole families, consequently also with their children, under the leadership of a farm worker named Stefan Andro, because the Crusade of the Poor, which cannot be called a real crusade, ended in Italy already in autumn 1212. Poor people on the Lower Rhine joined this crusade, led by a young man named Kurzfleisch.
Thanks for explaining.
Contact Report 478.
I did not want to interrupt your lengthy exposition because I think it is important for those human beings who will be able to read our published conversations. What is to be said about all that is written in this book, which I myself also know and have read throughout, is not based on truth, but on pure fantasy. But unfortunately, it is the case that many Earth humans have again fallen for this invented story and continue to fall for it, because untruths are more important to all those who want to see something supernatural and supernatural, or simply something inexplicable and fantastic in everything. But once two questions from me. How far have you progressed with the translations of the Goblet of the Truth, so that you can put the first sections of the English version on the internet? It would have been necessary to do this for some time. And how far have you progressed with your new book, God Delusion? It would be important that this book is published next, when the 10th block of Contact Talks is finished.
The first 2 or 3 sections are done so far, but we're still waiting for the translation of the New English copyright. Unfortunately, we also always have great difficulties with the translations, because there are simply not the necessary words and terms in the English language, which we have in the German and Swiss German language. As a result, many things cannot be translated correctly. I will finish the new book next month.
This new English copyright version is not of great importance, so you should immediately make what you have already worked out accessible to Earth humans via the internet. That alone is important, but not the copyright. On the other hand, it is important that the new book is distributed. As far as translations are concerned, I am well aware of the difficulties, including the completely wrong interpretation of the word idol, which is wrongly interpreted as idol, but which is fundamentally wrong, as our linguists have explained to me. An idol can never be compared to an idol, just as an idol cannot be compared to an idol. Their explanation is that an idol note Billy, idol, Greek eidolon, lat. Idolum, the image, the figure, embodies a shadow image of the isolated respectively separated from the normal, especially with regard to mental emotional movements. These are such that, through a pathological disturbance of the function of understanding and reason, a delusion arises, through which one's own esteem is disregarded, and this is only directed towards the delusional image. This is then the idol, which, like a ghost, is regarded as a special phenomenon and is vehemently swarmed over, idolized, and admired as something very special and particular, just as a figure, whereby this can only ever be a human being. The reasons for the veridolization of human beings can be very diverse. For example, related to their appearance, their manner of speaking, the pitch of their voice, their singing, their world of thoughts and feelings, their deeds, their actions, their work, their behavior and conduct, their knowledge and achievements, etc. Contrary to this is the idol, who embodies an idolatry respectively, a counter-god to a religiously recognized God and God-creator. An idol is in any case an artificially produced object or a statue, etc., which is thought to be a creating and creative force, and which is supposed to influence the fate and the prosperity and destruction of human beings. An idol is in any case a concept modified from the religious concept of God, which is an idol opposed to a religious deity and thus an idol. An idol is in any case considered to be a higher being in one form or another, in the form of a worshipped object, a picture or statue, etc. In the originally monotheistic sense of religion, the term idol means false god. Seen in the true sense of this interpretation and facts, also within all monotheistic religions, as well as within all non- or polytheistic religions, all their images, cult utensils, statues, and ritual objects, etc., are idols. Idols, with and by which and through which idolatry is performed.
Very good explanation. Could have also occurred to me. So Christianity with all its sects is also included in this, whereby Catholicism in particular is in the forefront, which, quite ironically, also glorifies the Pope as the representative of a God Father, respectively God Creator. But I have written something similar in the Book of Delusions of God. But even this explanation will not allow the earthly linguists to correct and eliminate their misdefinitions of the word terms, so that there will still be great misunderstandings about the values of words and concepts.
Contact Report 496.
All right. Sorry, because you are used to me asking questions about what I am interested in. And since I was not interested in it before, of course, so this matter is now settled, so we can turn to other things. I still have a question about Troy, because there is still a lot of confusion. Your daughter Simyase once said that the Troy story with the beautiful Helen of Homer was a fiction. She said that Homer actually lived and wrote the Iliad, but that he told a lot of fibs, because the beautiful Helen did not exist, nor did a Greek army besiege Troy, which is not supposed to have been called that either. The Trojan horse, Simyase also said, was a fib from Homer.
What my daughter told you is true. First of all, the city that Homer made known as Troy, which is why we also call it Troy, has a completely different name, and in fact the city was actually called Milutia. The Greek army that besieged the city and finally bloodily conquered it was in reality an army of the Hittite Empire. So it was the Hittites who truly besieged and conquered the city, staging a merciless slaughter of human beings. But the city of Milutia was not conquered by the Hittites by building a Trojan horse, which Homer had fantasized about and which was supposed to have been pulled into their city by the inhabitants of the city. In truth, after a long siege, the Hittites entered the city through an underground system of canals and through the very large city gate, raped women, men, and children, and then mercilessly slaughtered these and many other inhabitants. The whole thing was about a brutal act of war in which no beautiful Helen played any role whatsoever, not even any Hellenic army.
Aha, so that was it, and Homer was an imaginative storyteller.
Orally transmitted stories of earlier events he mixed with fantastical embellishments that had nothing to do with reality and truth.
This will not please Homer's followers, nor the many others who take all the Homer stories at face value.
That will be the case.
Contact Report 559.
Thanks for the explanation. The story is not known to me. But because of the Taurus man, the Greek mythology comes to my mind. The legend of the Minotaur, the human being of the bull. At the time of Minos, the king on the island of Crete, he asked the sea god Poseidon for a particularly beautiful and powerful bull to sacrifice to him. Poseidon heard the request, created such a bull, and let it rise from the sea. King Minos, however, was so blinded by the beauty of the animal that he kept it for himself, but intended to slaughter another for the sea god. Poseidon, however, became angry and punished the king by casting a spell on Minos' wife for breaking the word, Queen Pasiphae. She fell in love with the bull and commissioned the court artist Daedalus to build a wooden cow, which was hollow inside and covered with fur. When this was done, she climbed into the hollow cow to be mounted and mated with Poseidon's bull because he liked the work of art and felt attracted to it. Then 9 months later, the queen gave birth to a child, a monster, half human being, half bull, the Minotaur. This animal-human child grew up and became big and strong, preferring to eat human beings. But to prevent this Minotaur from causing any harm, the king ordered his master builder Daedalus to build a labyrinth in which the monster was locked up and could not escape. To feed the Minotaur, King Minos had 7 boys and 7 girls kidnapped every 9 years from the city of Athens, which he had subjugated, and then had them taken to Crete and thrown to the monster. One of the young men was Theseus, a son of the sea god Poseidon and stepson of the king of Athens. But the daughter of King Minos, Ariadne, fell in love with him and helped him to kill the monster in the labyrinth. To help Theseus find his way out of the labyrinth, she gave him a wooden spool with a long thread wound around it, which he unwound as he entered the labyrinth and marked his path, which he followed and found on his way back out. But as for your explanation of Persia and the relief, I cannot say anything about it, for the whole thing is unknown to me. Unfortunately, I do not know much of the old Persian history either, but I do know, for example, that the early Aryans lived there, which then spread to India. I also know that before the Aryans in the Neolithic Age, small groups of Stone Age people lived in the Persian highlands as hunters, as your father Sfath once explained to me in the 1940s, when he showed me some things in Persia. He himself always called the country Persia, which is what I have remained with. So I used this name when I traveled the country several times in the 1960s. That was also accepted by the people in Persia, and I accepted it. And I still use the name Persia today, although I know that Persia was also called Iran by the Aryans and other inhabitants of the country at an early stage, as an abbreviation of Iran Shar, as the old name was called in the Central Persian language. This old Iranian form of the country name, as Sfath explained at the time, meant land of the Aryans, although to my knowledge, in the Persian language Farsi, which is the most widespread Persian language in the country today, the term Iran is supposed to mean of noble origin and is directly derived from the Aryans. The old term Persia, as your father explained, dates back to the time of the Achaemenids, who created the first Persian Empire in the 6th century before Emmanuel Kruer. From the Greek side, the central area was called Landscape Persis, which to my knowledge today includes the province of Fars around Shiraz. In 1935, if I recall correctly, it was then that Shah Reza Shah Pahlavi, Reza Chan, or whatever his name was, and who was also called Reza Shah the Great, began to modernize some things in Persia, as a result of which he banned the name of Persia and only allowed the name Iran to be used, thus restoring the validity of the country's traditional name. In fact, Reza Shah was a simple soldier before joining the Persian Cossack Brigade, where he quickly worked his way up to become commander-in-chief, and then, in the ruler's cabinet, whose name I unfortunately forget, defense minister. Later, he also became prime minister under Ahmad Shah, only to be replaced by the Shah of Persia or Iran. That is what I still know about Persian history, unfortunately, along with very little else.
Contact Report 571.
Since Plato's philosophical Platonic love teaching, the human beings understand it as a love of two human beings for each other, which should be without any sexual interests, and which should only be expressed in thoughts and feelings of a strong connection and mutual affection. So Plato's love is called a love without sexual fulfillment, claiming that non-sexual love is much more commonplace than it generally appears. A claim which, in my opinion, corresponds to a lie, because the human being, man or woman, is affected by erotic impulses, also in so-called close and deep friendships, whether they are of the opposite sex or of the same sex. If human beings, again in my opinion, also cultivate a so-called Platonic love, then in a very close, deep friendship it can only be a one-sided, unrequited, and unfulfilled love, be it between man and woman, or man and man. So a Platonic love can be nothing more than an illusion and a rapture without hand and foot. The whole thing is based on a Platonic philosophical impossibility, whose motives Plato probably sought in a spiritualized love and in ascetic ideals, which were completely unworldly and still are and will remain so today. Plato himself did not have the slightest idea of his Platonic theory of love in his time, because he only talked about it, as Svath once explained to me. Unfortunately, this philosophical impossibility was also taken over thoughtlessly by religions, sects, and various other ideologies. Platonic love is a form of love that has been named after the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, 428, 427, 347 before Emmanuel, since the Renaissance. The whole thing is based on a philosophical theory which is based on a, in my opinion, false foundation of a friendly love which seems utopian to me in its aspiration, whereby the advocates of this false philosophical thesis refer to the untenable philosophical conception and explanation of Plato. In modern usage, however, the term Platonic love has not only a meaning but also secondary meanings that have little or nothing to do with Plato's original concept of philosophy. Plato saw love eros as a striving of the human beings in love, which should always lead him from the particular to the general, and from the isolated to the comprehensive. And according to Plato's theory, this should happen when the human being in love appears or wants to become a philosopher, so that he or she cultivates love in the manner described by Plato. If the human being in the sense of Plato consciously chooses a philosophical path, then this path should lead him to higher and higher knowledge. In this way, Plato taught, the erotic urge is directed more and more towards more general, higher, more comprehensive, and therefore more rewarding values in the course of a gradual process of knowledge. By this he meant conscious ethical forms and values. In this philosophical teaching, if it is to be considered as such, the most general reality that can be achieved in this way, the most worthy and valuable thing that Plato defined as the beautiful thing in itself, is ultimately revealed. If, according to Plato's philosophical theory, this goal is reached, then the human being's search for love should end there, and this is because it is only at this goal that the loving human being finds the perfect fulfillment of his striving. If the philosophical Platonic love is considered more closely in modern usage, it is the expression of a close friendship in which the persons who are friends are not supposed to have any sexual interest in each other. However, the term Platonic love is also used for a potentially erotic relationship in which the human being voluntarily, or as a result of certain circumstances, renounces or has to renounce sexual fulfillment. In this case, it is not a question of philosophical justification, motivation, or objective, but only of renunciation as such. In fact, very often there is no philosophical justification at all, but usually pure reason, pure understanding, decency, and integrity. On the other hand, however, there may also be a reason for this in the way that, firstly, the ability for sexual activity is simply lacking. Secondly, because there is no opportunity for it. And thirdly, because the beloved person does not consent to sexual intercourse. In my opinion, Platonic love, even if it is related to a very close friendship, is based on a pure illusion, because in the case of a very close friendship, both the woman and the man have almost inevitably erotic feelings for each other in their thoughts and feelings. So, this is really to be understood in the case of very close and deep friendship relationships, which go far beyond normal and everyday interpersonal friendships, which cannot necessarily be measured by the same standard of eroticism as so-called everyday friendships. Even in the case of everyday, normal, open friendships which do not fall into the realm of very close and deep friendship, erotic impulses are not necessarily excluded under certain circumstances, because the human being's sexual drive is quite naturally predetermined and cannot simply be denied, even if many human beings deny this fact with regard to their own personality and therefore say the untruth about it.
Contact Report 579.
Now, first of all, I want to explain the term spirit, Geist, respectively, which is origin term Geist, which actually traces back to Nocademian and is to be found in the storage banks, although in this also the meaning awaken can be found. If here, for example, of creative spirit energy is to be spoken, then this means creative revival energy. From this is to understand that the creation, or rather the creation energy, is a factor of awakening, respectively of creating, and I mean through the power, vibrations, and impulses here its own energy. Only in this sense is to understand the term spirit. A giving in the storage banks explains that the term is recorded from time immemorial, staying constant up into the ancient German language, out of which indeed finally the German language originated. When then the language stem German was pushed into the background, the term Geist underwent various changes, whereby ultimately the term was shaped to the word Geist, spirit. With the entire change process was then also the sense of the term lost, and was explained with shiver, frighten and arouse, etc., then ultimately in the new time to come to be mixed with the religious and sectarian idea of a god spirit, which also had found admittance in Greek with pneuma, spirit, and in Latin with spiritus, spirit, etc. The spirit was, for example, also associated with a soul with a beyond expectation, and includes up to the present time also often spiritual acceptance regarding a not being bound in the physical body, however also with an influencing pure or absolute, transpersonal or even transcendental intelligence, which was created by a god or similar in nature to him, if not just to be identical with him. In the Christian world of ideas in comparison is even a Holy Ghost, to be understood as a person, in a symbolic way as doves or as eyes representing spirit gods.
Contact Report 592.
It is unlikely to be listened to, nor will all the prophecies and predictions made and published since the early 1950s and up to the present day. The earthlings are stubborn and autocratic, and think they have fed the knowledge and correct ways of life and wisdom with shovel excavators. What has come out of this, however, is evident in all the natural disasters and in all the diseases, epidemics, etc., but especially also in the global terrorism, the acts of war and the uprisings, etc., which are not only political, but usually fanatical religious sectarian in nature. Hatred of religion, foreigners, race, and nations has already become a global factor which can hardly be stopped, because it is becoming more and more widespread, and will cause a catastrophe in this respect. It is already clear that the migration of peoples in the form of waves of refugees from all over the world to the so-called civilized, industrialized countries, etc., will play a very important role in this process. The mixing of different cultures, religions, sects, and political discrepancies which has been caused by these migrations and refugee flows to foreign countries for a long time already, corresponds to a root of evil because it opened the Pandora's box, for which the first steps were taken decades ago. Although the ominous Pandora's box is a myth, it is a myth that must be translated into the reality of world and human events. But maybe it is interesting for some Earthlings to know what is behind this myth, which is probably why I should name it. According to Greek mythology, Hephaestus, the god of fire and the blacksmith or metal artist, created the first woman to be given the name Pandora out of clay on the instructions of the god Zeus. She was part of the punishment for mankind because Prometheus had stolen the fire. Epimetheus, the one who thinks after, the brother Prometheus, the one who thinks ahead, then married Pandora. God Zeus gave Pandora a large closed earthen storage jug or wine jug falsely translated as a box and told her that it was not to be opened under any circumstances. The jug had been filled by every Olympian with a special gift, all of which, except for hope, were perishable. Against the order of God Zeus to keep the jar closed, Pandora opened it immediately after her marriage, from which all vices and vices escaped and spread throughout the world. So she unleashed all the vices and plagues that were in the jar onto mankind. According to the myth, this was the time when evil and wickedness conquered the world, where mankind had not known evil, trouble, or disease, nor even death. The only positive thing in the pitcher was the hope that was at the bottom of the pitcher, and before this hope could also escape, the pitcher was closed again. So the world became an extremely bleak place, full of deception, jealousy, greed, hatred, disease, war, vice, lies, plagues, revenge, sectarianism, retribution, epidemics, addictions, crime and slander, etc. The plagues were intended by Zeus as punishment for the human beings for the robbery of fire by Prometheus. He warned his brother Epimetheus never to accept a gift from the gods, so as not to harm the human beings. Epimetheus, however, did not heed the warning, and, beguiled by the beauty of Pandora, he married her. She later opened the jug again, and only then was hope also released into the world and allowed to spread. According to Greek mythology, this alone made it possible to fight all evil and all vices and plagues, in the hope of defeating them. With regard to Epimetheus and Prometheus, Greek mythology also tells us the following. Epimetheus, the one who thinks after, was the brother of Prometheus, the one who thinks ahead, who is considered a friend and cultural founder of mankind, and also the creator of the human beings and animals. If we look at this myth, we find it frighteningly illustrates what is rampant among earthly mankind, all vices and plagues of every kind. On the other hand, however, there is the hope that sooner or later the earthly humanity will become reasonable and free itself from all evil and negativity by symbolically locking and sealing all vices and plagues of the Olympians into the Pandora's jar, or Pandora's box, so that humanity can finally live in love, freedom, joy, peace, happiness, and harmony. But if hope remains nothing more than hope, then it is probably the greatest evil to which the human beings of the earth have fallen prey, and consequently hope becomes the greatest curse of humanity on earth, because it is endlessly tormented in hopelessness by all vices and plagues and by all other evils. But this hopelessness is still replaced and carried on endlessly by new hopes, and the agony of hopelessness will continue endlessly, unless the vices, plagues, and all other evils which have afflicted humanity on earth are seriously fought and defeated.
What more can I say than that I can only confirm all your statements and statements? The Pandora's box was not really a box, but an earthen wine jug, and the whole mythological statement is of course based on an invented fable, just as it is in relation to Adam, Eve, and the serpent.
I know that, and there are also similar mythologies in many peoples around the world, about the creation of the first woman and how all the evil and wickedness came into the world. But you also know this, because you have dealt with such mythologies, as you once told me in private. But now I am interested in how you see the poisons that are applied to plants, fruits and vegetables, and I am thinking especially of those poisons that are used against insects, such as pesticides, especially the new poisons neonicotinoids. Not only do these poisons kill birds or reduce their numbers, they also kill benign insects and other life forms that are important for the survival of nature. Wild animals and domestic animals such as cattle, horses, sheep, goats, rabbits, and poultry. And finally, also the human beings are affected by these poisons.
That is correct. In the narrower sense, pesticides are means of controlling insects and other pests, whereby these poisons are intended to kill, drive away, or inhibit annoying or harmful living creatures in their brood and in their growth or reproduction.
Contact Report 599.
That's exactly what Svath, your father, told me. But can you tell me to what extent the earthly neurologists already have knowledge in this respect, and whether the term parasomnia is also correct for this dreamless and creative deep sleep phase, as it was listed in the article mentioned?
The earthly neurologists have indeed been dealing with these phenomena for quite some time, although they have not yet found any noteworthy findings with regard to consciousness and its levels, which are decisive for the phenomena. The neurologists call it parasomnia, whereby this term comes from the Greek language and means para, that is to say bay, werend, neben, and Latin somnus, sleep. Consequently, the whole can be evaluated, that is to say, translated as occurring during sleep. Increased activity of the post-central gyrus may cause parasomnia during deep sleep. The post-central gyrus is the winding located on the parietal lobe of the cerebrum behind the central sulcus. There lies the somatosensory cortex, that is to say, the bark area in which tactile perceptions of the body are directly processed. In the state of the phenomenon parasomnia, in which beta waves occur, as they are present in the waking state, all the manifestations mentioned by you can occur, as well as very undesirable and inappropriate behaviors, which, however, usually only arise from the dreamless deep sleep. It can come to the fact that the sleep process is interrupted, whereby there is then no or hardly more a possibility that the sleep becomes still restful. The whole thing is effectively a sleep disorder, which can occur, for example, as early as childhood as a result of a temporary brain ripening disorder, but which is corrected in the course of aging and can in itself be regarded as harmless. If, however, adults are affected, then the matter is usually more complex and shows conspicuous and special behaviors. Under certain circumstances, medical clarification may be necessary in one or the other case, in particular if the phenomenon causes damage to the health of the person concerned or disadvantages and dangers to fellow human beings.
That gives me material to think and learn again.
Contact Report 618.
What you say, I can understand. And indeed also with regard to the fact that your words correspond to the rightness, by you saying that the term prophet is to be interpreted religious sectarianly because since time immemorial and up into the present time, someone is thus described by the earth human who has fallen into a purely religious or a sectarian belief and feels called upon by their God to proclaim the godly truth as a prophetic admonisher and seer. In this wise, such a human being of earth will be recognized, treated, and often also worshipped and adored by the religious and sectarian believers as a religious authority. However, in the sense of the bringing, teaching and communicating of the spiritual teaching, that is to say, the teaching of the prophets, that is to say, the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life. There is solely and exclusively the teaching, but no prophecies. However, might beyond the bringing of the teaching of the teacher's prophetic statements or effective predictions, then these do not stand in direct connection with the teaching, but in relation to logical thinking with regard to combinations of happenings, probability calculations, real dreams, and real visions. Nevertheless, all these values are not based in the teaching, but in the consciousness-based capabilities of the prophesying and predictive person. The origin of the term prophet, however, is found in the ancient Greek language, namely in the word prophets, which means, for example, proclaimer of oracular sayings, as well as seer and soothsayer. In the term prophets, it amounts to two pieced-together words, pro, which means before, and phemi, which is to be interpreted as speech or speaking. Furthermore, from this the term Fauna follows, which means so much as speaking, from which in turn follows the term profpanai, which is to be understood as predict or proclaim. The whole thing was already adopted very early from Christianity and from Islam, and implemented in all the languages of the believers who belonged to these religions and their sects, which was thus retained until the present day and has general validity in all decisive fields of language. With regard to the spiritual teaching of the prophets, that is to say, teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, as well as naming those human beings who bring, teach, and spread this teaching, the term teacher should fundamentally be used, as you have also said this yourself. Also, the terms prophet or mission fulfiller could be used, as also, nevertheless, prophesier, if the corresponding teacher just makes prophecies, which clearly puts the possibilities of coming happenings and so forth. If set causes are pursued further and cannot someday be changed for the better, therefore, they ultimately lead to the prophesied effects. Only in this sense can a prophesizer person be seen and understood if they are called as prophet or prophetess or come forth as a male or female proclaimer, admonisher, caller, and seer as well as warner. However, what now results from this? That one calls yourself a prophet is thus based simply in the fact that you've made and also continue to make diverse prophecies, if you so desire it. But this designation may be absolutely omitted for your person and your work, because the whole of this term does not correspond to what you are effectively doing, namely teaching and spreading the spiritual teaching, that is to say, the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life. Therefore, plainly and simply, you should rightly also be called teacher. And this designation should also be taken into account, even though you have made certain prophecies, and that you have also made a great number of predictions as a predictor, that over the course of time have fulfilled as well and continue to fulfill themselves, just as also certain prophecies. That also does not change the fact that you are a teacher of the spiritual teaching, that is to say, the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, and teach and spread this teaching. Thus you should also be referred to as teacher and as nothing else.
Contact Report 630.
Excuse me. It was not my intention to embarrass you, but I would like to explain what Abderathite means and where the term comes from, namely from an old satirical but psychologically and sociologically constructed novel entitled Die Abderiten, written by a German author named Christoph Martin Wieland, who lived in 2 different centuries, because he was born in the 18th century and died in the 19th century. Abderiten is actually a term for fools who commit foolish acts, as they have been since time immemorial and still appear in earthlings today. Abderates are also referred to by another term as simple and as shield citizens, and thus also as naively stupid people, whereby the original term Abderit, however, does not come from Old German, but from Ancient Greek, namely in connection with the ancient city of Abdera. The whole thing with the Abderites, who are also called shield citizens, is not connected with the German shield citizens, whose history leads back to the place Schild, which is said to have existed in the Middle Ages in Germany, whose citizens were therefore called shield citizens according to their city name. The whole thing is probably a legend and probably has nothing to do with today's town of Schildau or Belgern Schildau, a Saxon town in the district of Nordsaxon. The shield citizens are said to have been strange people who, in principle, did everything wrong and wrong that they touched and did. It is even said to have been so that they understood and implemented everything that was said and explained to them exactly as it was said and explained to them. Of course, all this stupidity could not be concealed, so that it soon became known everywhere, which is why all over Germany there was laughter about the shield citizens. And so it emerged from this legend, for it really is about such a legend, that even today a human being is called a shield citizen if he misunderstands something, does something wrong, or acts wrongly.
I did not know that legend.
Contact Report 633.
In addition, that is to say, to Nano, it is probably in such a way that with this term surely many humans cannot begin much, although it belongs nowadays actually to the general education, whereby, so I suppose, nevertheless many cannot imagine under it what is meant by it actually. In general, nano is understood to mean only a tiny amount, but not that it is the Greek word nanos, which means dwarf, whereby nano, as it is used today, is a determinative word in composition, with the meaning of the 10 to 9 part of a physical unit, which is called n.
Contact Report 710.
The term academic derives from the name of the ancient Greek hero Akademos, and usually denotes teaching and research activities at universities, as well as rarely any activities at academies. Basically, however, an academic question refers to any problem based on assumptions and conjectures, the solution of which has little or no practical relevance and is actually useless, except that holders of academic titles can boast about them.
Contact Report 716.
All the degenerate machinations unleashed by overpopulation resemble the earliest tale of the Pandora myth by the poet Hesiod, which relates that Zeus, the supreme god in Greek mythology, had the beautiful, seductive woman Pandora made by the artistically gifted fire god Hephaestus. And one day she was given a golden box to give to all human beings, but forbade them to open it. After a short time, however, Pandora herself opened the box, as Greek mythology relates, whereby all the evils previously unknown to mankind, such as toil, disease, all evil and death, etc., escaped from the box and have ruled the world ever since. This was part of the punishment for mankind as a result of the fire stolen by Prometheus.
Contact Report 721.
All the conventions created by Nocedemian in primeval times and brought to earth in the course of time and forgotten were, however, brought here again by early Play-Aran some time before antiquity, when other earth foreigners were also coming and going and had already spread all over the world. Even from these, however, the early Play-Aran kept themselves secret for millions of years, so as not to provoke interplanetary conflicts and also not to let such excesses break into their dimension. So they also held back from the earth foreigners who ruled in various pre-ancient countries on earth, such as the Long Skulls, who exercised their might especially in the areas around the Nile and in the southland of the American continent. Later, in the time of antiquity, the philosopher Aristotle, as well as others, came back to the ancient teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life on the basis of a teaching by a Play-Aran sage or itinerant teacher called Fluijasan, who concealed his origin. Connected with this was also the OM comprising 77 million canons, whereby he was also made aware by the sage of the canon containing the teaching of the conventions of behavior as created by Nocedemian. From this, Aristotle created what became the moral ethical ethos doctrine, as it also became the sophists, the representatives of a group of Greek philosophers and rhetors or orators who spread their teachings in the 5th to 4th centuries BC. Rhetoricians were also human beings at that time who had mastered a good and already persuasive art of oratory, which was already known as a discipline in Greek antiquity and was actually nothing other than the origin of populism. And through this art of oratory, human beings were verbally lulled and persuaded for the purpose of what populist speeches were used for, such as on the one hand for a philosophical and also religious delusion, but also for influencing political elections and for electing a certain person to office and so on. In Greek antiquity, rhetoric played a particularly important role in this respect, especially in opinion-forming processes with regard to politics, but also with regard to religious and philosophical delusion. This is also the case today throughout the world, although in modern times the art of oratory has become much more sophisticated, and it has the same, but much more extensive effect. Because nowadays populism is also disseminated in various forms through the public media and beguiles the largely uneducated audiences, who unthinkingly defect to the populist speakers and blindly give them their votes. As already explained, the populist speech technique, which is also connected with a body language or posture corresponding to the speech, with corresponding body movements, gestures, facial expressions, voice power, and an expressing psychological constitution and mood, was already used in antiquity, and even before, by Greek, as well as by other philosophers and rhetors. Even then, these used their eloquence to influence and persuade the human beings listening to them and to get them to faithfully accept the doctrines and false doctrines that were populistically scrounged up in front of them, and to pay homage to the speakers. The religious delusionists were the first to bring false teachings to the human beings of Earth, which caused much harm, mischief, and enmity, especially the false teachings of religions and fanatical sectarian delusion, which led to murderous wars and terror among practically all peoples on Earth. The philosophers, on the other hand, brought false doctrines concerning the principle of life as well as concerning understanding, reason, intelligentum, and intellect, etc., whereby earthlingness was led astray and confused, and whereby this catastrophically stupid philosophical trend continues to this day. Apart from the roaring nonsense, which many philosophers of all times have brought and some of them still bring today, it must be conceded to them that diverse teachings concerning ethics, ethos, and morality were the focus of philosophical considerations, and thus brought Earth humans a teaching of the greatest and most special value. The ancient philosophers did not devise this valuable teaching themselves, so Aristotle did not either, but they took it over from a player and itinerant teacher, from a wise man who on the one hand had to conceal his origin, like many others, because the origin of certain Earth foreigners was not allowed to be recognized, but on the other hand he had special knowledge and also mastered the art of argument, of extensive verbal explanations, of explaining and proving. And in this way he spread the traditional teachings of ethics and morality as they were originally worked out and taught by Nocedemion. In this respect, only a few can be mentioned, whereby Socrates, Plato, Thucydides, Pythagoras, Anaxagoras, Parmenides, Heraclitus, and George of Leontinol should perhaps also be mentioned, although I do not know exactly which of these philosophers really dealt in depth with the teaching of ethos, ethics, and morals, as was the case with Aristotle. Apart from those mentioned, there were many other ancient Greek philosophers, of whom I only know a few names, but I would like to mention them and look them up on Wikipedia, and then mention them as an appendix after our conversation.
You can naturally do that.
Okay, I will. Then I want to go on and say that so ethics moved to the center of philosophical thought. But basically the name ethics and the philosophical discipline that came out of it basically leads back to the ancient player and itinerant teacher, Jason, as I know from the memory bank, though then the doctrine was openly taught and spread by the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. Thus he founded the scientific study of ethos on Earth, placing the habits, customs, and mores at the forefront of the actions and behavior of the human beings of Earth. According to his teachings, which he had taken over from the wise wandering teacher Jason, he came to the conclusion that human beings could and should be able to reflect rationally and theoretically, and that this also meant the practice of observing and perceiving real reality and its truth, in order to subsequently promote reflection and consideration, and then to connect the whole thing with something specific. In doing so, his idea was founded in the action, behavior, and realization of good, positive, and valuable manners of the human being, namely as a single individual in relation to himself, as well as individuals with each other as a family and as a group, and people among themselves. And it was from this viewpoint that Aristotle founded ethics, and with it a philosophical discipline, from which ultimately emerged the comprehensive field of the teaching of human action, conduct, and activity. And this doctrine became, from the ground up, the object of philosophical means with regard to the guidance of a normative or authoritative and guiding judgment, as well as the practical implementation and realization of the knowledge thus gained with regard to the ethical, moral, humane, and righteous behavior to be applied by the human beings of Earth.
Contact Report 722.
Now I have digressed again. Consequently, the talk must go back to what I was talking about before, namely the incompetence of the majority of those in power, who time and again bring evil disaster upon humanity and the world. And this is so because, in reality and truth, the lust for war and power and the warmongering of certain megalomaniacal and crazy state powers lacks any security, any semblance of peace and freedom. Effectively, there is always the threat of evil and, under certain circumstances, even nuclear war from these power-mad lunatics, as a result of which security, peace, and freedom are always on a knife's edge, and the sword of Damocles constantly hangs threateningly not only over a single people, but over all Earth humans. Explanation of the sword of Damocles. The expression comes from Greek legend and goes back to a court favorite named Damocles, although it is not known whether he actually lived or not. According to legend, he was a favorite of the tyrant Dionysius I or Dionysius II of Syracuse in the first half of the 4th century BC. The anecdote of the sword of Damocles from Cicero's Tusculanae Disputations 561-62 has been handed down. Damocles is said to have lived at the court of King Dionysius IV or II, and to have envied the ruler's might and wealth. For this reason, the king is said to have offered him a seat at the royal table at a banquet, although King Dionysius then placed a sword above Damocles' head and held it in place only by a single horsehair. This sword hanging over Damocles' head is said to have made it impossible for him to enjoy the evening, and all the good food and amenities correctly. The whole thing is said to have been a lesson from King Dionysius for Damocles to learn that success and wealth would not protect him from danger. Izmir 2019 Billy Boreal. If I try to translate this word from ancient Greek, that is to say Boreas, then it means something like the northern one, which then means northern climate, such as that of Europe, North Asia, and North America, whereby, as far as I know, the subpolar climate in the northern hemisphere is called this, which, as a northern climate, is, if I remember correctly, the coldest of the climates of the temperate zone, which largely corresponds to the boreal vegetation zone.
Contact Report 746.
Interesting, because this is exactly what our scholars, who know languages and scriptures, have explained, who cultivate knowledge and a knowledge of the origins and uses as well as the use of all earthly languages, which are completely foreign and unknown to all earthly linguistics. This also refers to the old Latin terms and to proliferate, which were already being handed down, used and completely misinterpreted in a mistaken way in the time of the Latins, and in this way, right up to the present day. The Latin term proliferate, which today is wrongly used for the proliferation of plants, originally had the value of usury in the sense of, for example, far overcharged returns of borrowed goods and coin values, etc. The term invadere, that is to say the modern usage invasive, in its original form means to adapt, to adjust, to integrate, to embed, to incorporate, and to insert, which is called to integrate in today's modern earthly languages. In this connection, however, our language and scripture experts declare the modernity of the new orthography, especially with regard to the German language, to be the thoughtless stupidity of incompetent and arrogantly self-important linguists who are incapable of judging either languages or scripts. According to the explanations of our language and scripture scholars, in the earthly languages, the Latin term invasive used today is completely wrongly and erroneously defined as invading and penetrating, as well as proliferating, in a very negative form, just as the old Latin term proliferate is also wrongly defined as proliferation. That is to say, the old Latin term proliferate is also wrongly defined as proliferation, offspring and sprout, and thus means a rapid growth and multiplication, as a proliferation of plants, woody plants, and all kinds of plants. The actual origin of the two terms goes back much further into the past than earthly scientists would be capable of and have the opportunity to do, in order to fathom the actual beginning of the same, as our scientists explain. The terms were created thousands of years ago, after very precise explorations and clarifications through time observations, in areas that can be described as Balkan Indian in modern times. The Avestic peoples, who were already linguistically adept in early times, used the three terms fenerara, which was later called fenerare in Latin, as well as prolivera, later proliferate, and invadra, later invadere, in a completely different form of expression, which, moreover, was never written down in any of the ancient written languages, but was only handed down orally and consequently did not find its way into any Avestic or Indo-Iranian writings in later times. These two terms, as well as fenerara and fenera, found their way into the languages of the Balkan Indians, who are nowadays called natives, primitive peoples, and indigenous people. The term fenerara, or fenerare, stood for uncontrolled spreading, dissemination and proliferation of plants, so that the correct term for the proliferation and uncontrollable spreading and dissemination of plants must be fenerative, but not invasive or proliferating. The folks who used Avestan languages were also highly developed linguistically and shaped their languages early on with relevant terms, which they partly also took over from other languages known to them, changed, and which were also adopted in many other languages, but which partly survived all times and have even been preserved until today, and also in the German and Swiss German languages. The term indigenous means as much as born in the land, but also the special relationship of the peoples to their natural environment. The three terms now, fenerara, invadere, and proliferate, originate from an Avestic language, which was then adopted in Balkan indigenous languages and later transferred to other languages, such as ancient Greek, which in turn found its way to the Latins, who also adopted certain terms. Consequently, the terms were exchanged in a multiply-changing manner and used for false values, which has remained so until today. As our language and writing experts explained to me, the Latin people also took over the terms from Greek dialects, whereby the wrong sequence of meanings also existed in these, so that the term fenerare was also wrongly ascribed a different meaning, as was also the term proliferate. And this happened in such a way that the two terms were erroneously exchanged for each other and thus twisted. This corresponds to the factual information I can give you after the explanations of our linguistic and scriptural luminaries.
So what I learnt from Svath, that is fenerative, is the correct term for the proliferation and uncontrolled spread of plants and crops of all genera and species, as opposed to the term proliferate, prolicative, and invasive is correct.
This is absolutely correct, and according to the statements and explanations of our linguists and scriptural scholars, it is so without any doubt. But now I have to go back to my duties, but I should inform you that Florina and Enjana will visit you in a few minutes and fulfill the wish you have expressed to them. But now I must go, my friend.
Contact Report 748.
What you think and how you put it all together can be described as correct, because you obviously understand the etymological traditional in this sense as the basic meaning of traditional and the like, not only with regard to a word, but also with regard to other things, such as our age of life.
Yes, that is indeed how I understand it, because that is how a knowledgeable one in ancient Greece explained it to me around 2,500 years ago, when Sfath and I were with him. This man also explained at that time that it was a shame how even then the word concepts were distorted and their actual values were lost. And this comes to my mind now, because in our German language would-be writers are always making and enforcing imbecilic falsifications in spelling, and consequently the same falsification of language is also being practiced today as in ancient Greek times. This, while today, in addition to the falsification of spelling, the German language is being strangled by denglification, and this primitive means of communication is slowly but surely destroying the beauty and the uniqueness of expression and the variety of words compared to all other languages in the world, and causing more and more valuable words and concepts to disappear.
Our language and scripture experts also complain about this.
Contact Report 750.
Stupidity is precisely when a human being does not think, and thus does not reconsider a matter, etc., due to laziness of thought, faith or defiance, etc., or when he or she is not capable of doing so due to a lack of intelligentum. And if a human being lacks intelligence, precisely that which, as a result of misnomer, ignorance, and time-honored misnomer, was called intelligence, and is still used in this wrong wise today, then all is lost, because consequently intellect and rationality cannot be used. I suppose this has to be explained over and over again. It is indeed necessary to explain this often and again, because the completely wrong terms which have been used erroneously for centuries express absolutely wrong factors which show other values than would be correct. This is the case of the false term intelligence, which effectively originated with the Latins through a banal misunderstanding of an ancient Greek term, which in its original meaning was something like intellect memory. I learned this from your father Sfath, who took me to an ancient people in the Far East, who, however, disintegrated in the course of time and scattered in the Orient. In any case, I learned that this people knew a term in their language that expressed the cognitivity of human beings, and thus the recognition and getting to know as well as the experience and thus also intellect, rationality, knowledge and information processing. This, while with another people in a different language and in a different wise, the same thing resulted, which ultimately also carried over to the present time. Although I still know and remember the connections, I no longer remember the names of the people, their language and their terms, except that one of the terms of this people, which was transferred into ancient Greek, gave rise to a new term describing the intellect, which then also gave rise to the term intellectum, which is valuable in German, as well as to another term of another ancient language. And this valuable word term intellectum basically means the human intellect.
This is familiar to me because you were in Crete together because you were interested in the mythological story about the Minotaur and wanted to know the truth about it.
Because at that time I wanted to get to the bottom of various stories from different mythologies in general, so also concerning the Minotaur, who is said to have been a human-eating monster, half human being, half bull. The Minotaur was a figure of Greek mythology and a creature with a human body but a bull's head. According to Greek mythology and legend, King Minos ruled Crete at that time, and was regarded and worshipped as the son of the god Zeus and the goddess Europa. Minos allegedly asked Poseidon, the sea god who is said to have been his uncle, for a miracle of help to become king of Crete, but also to prevent anyone else from becoming king. In doing so, Minos is said to have promised and sworn that he would sacrifice everything that emerged from the sea to the sea god for the rest of his life, including the mermaids who were already haunting the mythologies at that time, but who were in fact not human sea creatures but seals, which people mistakenly considered to be human beings because these mammals could easily be seen as human-like in the water. Poseidon, the saga goes, performed the miracle and Minos became king. In return for Minos becoming king, he was supposed to offer a sacrifice to the sea god, namely a magnificent bull which the latter sent to Minos, but which pleased the latter so much that he placed it in his own herd of cattle, only to sacrifice an inferior animal instead. Poseidon, however, is said to have become grim and pissed off, and boundlessly furious at this, and exacted sea divine revenge in such a way that he allegedly made Pasiphae, the wife of Minos, fall in love with the magnificent bull he sent to Minos as an offering. Pasiphae, the legend explains, as a result of her infatuation, then desired the sea divine bull in order to mate with it. And in order to be able to do this, she had Daedalus, a clever architect, inventor, and technician, who according to the legend was a descendant of the god Hephaestus, build a wooden mating frame. Daedalus, alias as he is called in German, I must explain this in between, was, according to the legend, an extremely jealous man who, when his pupil invented the saw, killed him by throwing him to his death from a high roof. Afterwards, according to the legend, he fled to Crete so as not to have to answer to the court in his hometown of Athens. He also took his son Icarus with him on his flight. But now back to Pasiphae, the wife of King Minos, for whom Daedalus, according to the legend, built a wooden mating rack that was covered with a cowskin, and in which the woman could hide in such a way that she was mated by the bull, so that she lay down in the cow mating rack and was impregnated by the bull. So, according to the legend, she did it and was copulated by the bull, and then, at the correct time, she gave birth to a son from this union, who was half human being and half bull, or the Minotaur, a monster with the form of a human being and the head of a bull. When King Minos was confronted with all that had happened to his wife and the bull, Daedalus had to build a labyrinth without an exit, but he secretly considered and built one, of which the king was unaware. When the labyrinth was finished, the king had the monster imprisoned in the labyrinth, also forbidding Daedalus to leave the island. One day, when King Minos received news that his son Androgeos had been killed by the fault of King Aegeus of Athens, he waged a revenge campaign against Athens and defeated the Athenians, after which he imposed a vicious tribute on them, namely that every 9 years they had to bring 7 youths and 7 virgins to Crete and the Minotaur's labyrinth, where they were sent to the Minotaur's labyrinth and sacrificed to it. Eventually, however, the saga continues. The matter was brought to an end by Theseus, the son and later successor of Aegeus, taking part in the 3rd tribute himself, killing the monster Minotaur in the process. Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos, fell in love with him and helped him with her Ariadne's thread, which he laid out in the labyrinth and thus, with the help of the thread, found his way through the labyrinth in which the Minotaur lived. There are other versions of this, but I won't talk about them, only that the legend says Theseus defeated and killed the Minotaur and found his way out of the labyrinth with the help of the thread laid out by Ariadne with the young men and maidens. King Minos finally had Daedalus and his son Icarus imprisoned in the labyrinth as punishment, because it was said that it was he who had unrolled the thread from the entrance to the labyrinth, so that the avenger Theseus could find his way out again. Daedalus, as the builder of the labyrinth, naturally knew the way out, and fled after first building wings for himself and his son Icarus to use to escape from the island. Together with Icarus, Daedalus climbed a high rock near the sea, where they both put on the prefabricated wings, and Daedalus warned his son not to climb too high into the sky, because otherwise the sun would melt the wax with which the feathers were attached to the wings. He also told him not to fly too low, because the spray from the sea would soak his wings and he could fall. When the two then flew off, so the legend goes, they were quickly over the open sea, with Icarus recklessly and cockily enjoying the flying so much that he climbed higher and higher into the sky. Consequently, it happened what his father had warned him about before. When he came too close to the blazing sun, the wax melted and the wings lost their feathers, so Icarus crashed into the sea and drowned. The island where his washed-up body was later found, according to the legend, was then named Icaria in his honor. Daedalus grieved greatly for his son, but he made it safely to Sicily, where he was received benevolently by King Cocolos, who later also protected him from King Minos, who wanted to take him back when he escaped after the affair concerning the wooden mating rack and the thread laid out in the labyrinth. After which, however, Daedalus lived for a long time and made many more great inventions as a technician. Today, he is considered the ancestor of all sculptors because he is said to have created the first large statues, which is not true, however, because I have seen larger sculptures much earlier, namely during journeys into the past that led back to the time of the Neanderthals about 50,000 years ago. But Daedalus is also regarded as the ancestor of the technicians, and also wrongly, because in this respect I also know, because I have seen it myself, that already more than 6,800 years ago in the southern flat areas of the Danube, and as far as the hilly foothills of the Bavarian alpine regions, human beings lived who had developed technical skills and laboriously cut thick discs from massive tree trunks, which were shaped like wheels and had a hole in the middle. A straight, thick branch was pushed through this, and then the whole thing was used as a kind of mill wheel for grinding grain and nuts, etc., into flour. Later, during a visit to the past about 3,600 years ago, I also saw the Sumerians in Mesopotamia chiseling wheels with centered holes out of large thick stones, which they fitted with thick axles and used to move carts. But what prompted me to let myself be taken back to Minoan times was the reason for wanting to find out how, why, and from what the Minotaur legend arose. And this I was indeed able to find out. The reality being that the Minotaurus legend had only arisen almost 3 centuries after the death of King Minos, and was based on something that had nothing whatsoever to do with the belief in the sea god Poseidon. The effective fact was that, as your daughter Simyase and I were no doubt able to learn and ascertain at the sites of the events of the time, Pasiphae, the wife of King Minos, was impregnated by him, and then gave birth to a son who was physically deformed, similar to the Elephant Man who lived in England in the last century. A film was also made of this man at the time, which I have seen, and moreover, he was shamefully and irresponsibly abused effectively as a money-making sensational show object, whereby various scoundrels were able to enrich themselves through his misery. I think you can find some information about this on the internet, at least a description of the person, his name, and his story. Maybe I can also find a photo, which is why I will have a look. If I also find a picture, I will add it to our conversation, but if possible, also a description.
Contact Report 767.
This term Samajic, Svath explained at the time, would later be adopted by the Babylonians, then by the Greeks, as well as later by the Latins, changed, and ultimately in the modern languages of modern times, incorrectly changed in a form of social and used for society.
Contact Report 779.
The form of prophecy comes from the ancient Greek expression propheteia for to utter, to say, or also to speak for someone, which is why the term prophecy is also often used, but this is completely wrong. In various religions, prophecies are used in a wide variety of contexts, on different occasions, and in different ways of receiving the alleged message. The ancient Oriental cults know many different types of such oracles, which take place through regular questioning of the otherworldly or gods at sacrificial sites, as well as before battles where ecstatic, exceptional messages and dream visions are offered, which are then interpreted as prophecy, that is to say, good omen. Not infrequently, various media are used for this purpose, such as animal organs, raptures or auditions and flights of birds, or even human sacrifices, etc.
Contact Report 782.
War, hatred, stabbing, persecution and murder of many people of other faiths, however, is still today the consequence of, mainly, religious faith, which is practiced, just as mainly, by fanatics who believe in Islam. And this was not enough, because through the whole of faith, the most diverse gods, and finally the many gods of Hinduism, such as mainly Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, Ganapati, and many others, as well as the divine principle Brahman, came into being. Then there were the ancient Greeks with their gods. They called the chief god Zeus, then Athena, Poseidon, Eris, Aphrodite, Helen, and Apollo. But there were also Demeter, Artemis, Ares, and Hermes, as well as Hestia and Hephaestus. With the Jews, Yahweh functions as God. With the Christians, it is the God and his allegedly incarnate son Jesus, the Savior, who was actually called Emmanuel and had nothing to do with an imaginary God, but only brought the teaching of the truth, teaching of the creation energy, teaching of the life. With Islam, then Allah. There are other female and male deities existing today in faith and fantasy en masse, depending on religion and sect, which are simply impossible to list because the whole religious nonsense of such imaginary religious fantasy figures is far too extensive and changes practically from day to day. Today this and that religious sect exists. Tomorrow it is already gone, while already a new one is causing the believers to go crazy again.
Contact Report 845.
Well, the term Catholicism actually goes back to the ancient Greek word katholon, which roughly means all-embracing. Consequently, Catholicism assumes and advocates in terms of belief that the Catholic faith is all-embracing, and all the trimmings are what guarantee and assure the kingdom of God, at least for those who believe in Catholicism.